I have a folder that contains pairs of WMV files and JPG files. The WMV file is a movie corresponding to some recording your erstwhile instructors have made for another course. There's one of me, and perhaps one of my co-author. And in addition, we have corresponding JPG files that can act as thumbnails for each of these sections of video. Now, of course, we could programmatically create those JPG files, but I'm keeping it simple here. So you must have, if you want to try this yourself, a similar folder where you have WMV files and take a screenshot of each one and store it as a corresponding JPG file. Now we have here the finished application, and we'll build this from scratch throughout this section and then following one. And I select a folder, go to the folder where those movies live. There it is. We have a list box containing those 3 JPG files. We have a splitter here, which lets me have a little more room for those JPG files. There they are. I can choose one, and then that movie plays here in a control that we'll create. We can change the volume. We can change the position. Let me grab this slider and move back. We can play or pause. There we go. We can go forward a bit or back a bit. We can stop. Then we start playing and it goes back from the beginning and so on. So it's a very rudimentary file viewer for WMV files. Some issues that come up are binding this list box so it displays the JPG files. And then once you select one, playing that file here. Also controlling the output of this and displaying all these controls neatly within this split panel here. So we'll learn how to do all of those things as we work through building this application from scratch. This sample uses some controls you've seen and some you haven't. Specifically, there's a grid splitter to split a grid and let you resize rows within the grid at runtime. There's a slider, which you've seen but you haven't used one. There's a text block and a media element control. And of course, we're also using grid, stack panel, and button, other controls you've already seen. There are some specific issues we'll need to work through. For example, we'll set the min height and min width to set minimum sizes for controls. There's no need to allow the main window to be any smaller than these particular sizes. There's the name attribute, which isn't generally required, but in this case, later markup will refer to a property of the window, so we'll be required to give the window a name. Let's start by laying out the main form. Here in Visual Studio, I'll create a new project, and the new project I'll name Video Browser and make it a standard WPF application. I'll set the title attribute of our main window to be Video Browser, so it just looks a little better. There we are. And let's set the height and width based on my experience with this demonstration. I'll set the height to be 550, the width to be 460, and I also want to set the minimum height and the minimum width, so those values never get too small. Minimum height equals 550, and min width equals 460. So the window is currently as small as it's going to get. I'll reduce it down so we can see it all, though I may expand it later so we can see a little better close up. Now the grid element also doesn't have a name at the moment, so I'll set that name attribute. So if we need to, we can refer to this thing in code to be video grid. There we are. I need a couple rows, actually 3 rows, so I'll set one there, one not very big, actually need a little more room than that. There we go. And that's it. Well, we've laid out the rows in the grid. Now I need a grid in the top so I can have columns just in that top row. Easiest way to do that is just put a grid in there. So we've put other controls in the grid. Why not a grid? So let's select it, come get a grid, drag it over. Now watch the designer as I move my cursor around. As I move the cursor around, a different row lights up, so I can tell where I'm going to drop this thing off. I'll drop it into that top row. Notice that there's no indication on this grid which row it's going to be in. That's because it's in the top row. If I moved it to a different row, say the bottom one, we would see we have a grid.row attribute telling us it's in row 2. But if you put it in the 0th row, it doesn't need to explicitly specify that. I don't need the margin to be set. I want this thing to fill the entire top row of this thing. But I do want the name to be top row grid. There we go. All right. Well, we also now need 2 columns in that grid. So again, I can click in the margin and create a column. And notice that the column delineation does not extend all the way down the main grid. That's because we're working with properties of that top row grid. If you do see a line in your Visual Studio that goes all the way down, you're clicking on the wrong thing. Here, I just want to divide that top grid, and that's all I've got here. Let's check out to make sure things are okay using the Document Outline window. There it is, and you'll see that we have the main window, then a grid, and then 3 row definitions. Then we have the top row grid and 2 column definitions. So everything looks to be nested correctly. Let's add some controls to the grid. Let me close this down. Select this. Let's add a button here. Again, you can see different cells light up as I get ready to drop that button. That seems like a good location. Let's remove the height and the margin and set the name to be Select Folder Button. We don't need to specify the vertical alignment. And we can set the text to be Select Folder. Better spell it right. There we go. Over here, we want a list box in the second column, so let's go get one. List box, place it here. Oops, didn't get it quite right. Let's drag it to the right location. There we are. And we can also specify here its margin, which would be 0, so it fills the entire contents. And let's set here the name Video List Box. Okay, so now we have our list box. Those 2 are easy. We need next a grid splitter to go in this row so we can move this grid row up and down. Well, let's go back and find the grid splitter. It's down here somewhere. Drag it on, and even though we light up that center row, the grid splitter shows up vertical, not horizontal. So I'll need to set some properties. I could do this over here in the Properties window, but there's a lot of properties of the grid splitter, and it's a lot of effort to change them here because you have to reset a lot of properties. If you want to do that, you can, but it's easiest just to remove the properties you don't want set, like the row span, don't need. Height, I need set to 5. Horizontal alignment, I want set to stretch. Margin, I don't want set at all. Name, I want just set to grid splitter, removing the 1. Vertical alignment, don't need set. And the width, I don't need set. That should get us a grid splitter that goes horizontally across the row it's in. The trick is to specify the height that you want and the horizontal alignment that you want, in this case, stretching horizontally. Well, we need to set some row and column definitions here. Let's go to the main grid and specify for the main grid the heights of these things. I want the height of this row to be 120. That is where it starts out anyway. And I want the min height to be 120. So it'll never be smaller than that. How could it get smaller if it's a fixed height? Well, the grid splitter can raise and lower that grid split, and it could become smaller if we didn't manage that. No smaller than 120. Okay, the height of the next row should be set to auto. Remember what auto does? It says make the row just big enough for the contents of the row. A 5-pixel high grid splitter. We'll set the height of the final row just to be star, which says take the rest of the space. Remember how the grid divides up its row definition space. It first looks for rows that have a fixed height and allocates that space. Next, it looks for rows that have auto height and allocates that space, because in this case we need 5 pixels for that automatically allocated space. Finally, it looks at all the rows that have asterisks in their heights and allocates the space accordingly. We only have the one row in this case, so it takes the rest of the space. Let's look at the column definitions for that top row grid. I want the width of the left button to be, 115 seems to work well for me, and I want the width of the second column just to be a star. So it takes just the right amount of space. Oops, 115 star won't do, makes it in the ratio of 115 to 1. That's not right. I just want it to be exactly 115 pixels. I think we're done. We've got everything laid out the way we want it, and we've set the properties of everything we need. Let me save this and run it and verify that it works. There are 2 grids, the main grid and the upper grid. The button, of course, doesn't do anything, but the splitter does. The grid splitter allows us to resize the grid rows, but we can't make it any smaller than 120. That is the minimum size for this grid. It won't go any smaller than that. Well, so far we've laid out the main form. It's time to think about creating the media player user control, which we'll place in this area. To create our movie player control, we could add the media handling controls directly to the main form. That would work fine. It makes more sense, however, to encapsulate them as a user control. That way, we could reuse this media player, that's what we'll call it, a media player control, more easily in other applications. Let's create a user control and then place it on our form once we add some code to make it do something. Back in Visual Studio, I need to add a user control. And to do that, I can right-click on the project, choose Add, and here, choose User Control. I can supply a name for it, and I'll call it Movie Player Control. And again, I could have put this in a separate user control library, but because I only have the one, I just put it in here. In real life, I probably would have put it in a separate assembly so I could more easily reuse it. Well, this looks a lot like just a window, and it kind of is. It works much like a window. The XAML looks very much like a Windows XAML. You have the user control rather than the window element, but you have a grid inside, and you have the same 2 namespaces defined as you would for a window. Well, I need specifically here to add a name for this grid so I can refer to it, so I'll specify a name attribute and call it Movie Player Grid. Okay, I need 3 rows in the grid, so I'll set those up. There we go. Let's take a stack panel and use it up here. Now, we're not really going to place more than one control in here, but it makes the media element control that we are going to place in it look better. It has a better background when it's inside a stack panel control. So let me take this, put it here, and just modify everything in here. We don't need a margin. I'll call this Preview Stack Panel. And I do want this thing to have a background of black. There we go. So that's where we'll put our media element control. Well, let's go get one. Click here, go get the media element control, which allows us to display our movie file. There it is. And again, I just want it to fill the entire region. So I will get rid of the height. I will name it Movie Player. The width, I'll just remove that. Now there are some properties I want to set that control the behavior of this media element control. Specifically, I'll set the loaded behavior to be manual so that we have to manually load the movie and play it, and the unloaded behavior so that when the control is unloaded, it automatically closes the content. There we go. So we have our media element. those two attributes we set are important behaviors of the media element. Without those, our code wouldn't work correctly. You might want to investigate other options for loaded behavior and unloaded behavior so you can see how that would affect our later code. What else do we need? We need a slider control in this second row, so I'll go out and get it. Where is slider? Slider. Slider. There you are. Okay, it seems, at least it's got the correct orientation now. We need the grid.row set. We'll name this thing. We don't need height. Well, we do need the height. Nope, we want it to fill the entire space. We don't need a margin. The name we'll set to be position slider, because that'll indicate the position within the movie. And let's actually set the margin to be 2, so it's got a little bit of a margin around it, so it looks a little better. Now I also need to specify for the slider its minimum and maximum values. The minimum I want to be 0, and the maximum I want to set to be 1. And the reason I do that is because the position property of the media element is always a value between 0 and 1. Okay, we've got our slider set up. We'll make it fit better once we set the row definition heights. So let's go do that for our grid. There are 3 row definitions. Let's set the height of this one to be star and the min height to be 50. So it never gets any shorter than that. Let's set the height of the middle row to be auto. There we go. So it's just big enough for the slider and the margin. And the height of the bottom row to be 55. So it's just big enough for the buttons we'll place down there. There we go. So there is the layout for our control. Well, we're almost done. We need to get the buttons down in the bottom. So how do we do that? Well, we'll click once again, and let's place a grid down there. Well, that doesn't seem right. We need the margin to be 0, so it fits exactly. And let's set the name of this thing to be Media Controls Grid. There we go. Let's add 5 columns. So 4 times we click up here. There we go. Let's set the width property of each of them just to be star, so they're all evenly spaced. Easy enough to do. 5 evenly spaced columns. Let's put a button in each one of these first 4 columns. Better click there first. Let's put a button. Let's just resize it so it's the right size. There we go. And I'll just copy and paste a bunch of those. There we are. And for each one of them, you know, it actually would have been easier had I fixed them up first. So let's just do that. Let's come fix this up. Remove the margin. And that should do. Great. And now we can copy and paste this so it's easier. That one goes here. And actually, if you watch carefully, you can see it's actually pretty easy to get these in the right place. Those little brown lines click into place when we get it in the correct location. There we go. And for each one of these, I want a margin of 5. And again, I probably should have done that first. So let's just fix these things up. Here I want the name of this to be back button. I want a margin of 5 and the text to be back. There we go. And actually, you know, that's the button I wanted here. So I'll move it there. And let's remove the margin, set the margin back to 5. I'll get this right. There we go. Okay, and let's do this one. This one should be play button. Its column is 1. Its margin is 5. And the text definitely doesn't span any columns, and the text is play. Actually, for this one, I want a fixed width because we're going to change the text between play and pause. And I don't want it to resize itself. So I'll change this so the width is 45 and never changes. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This one has a name of Stop Button, and it has a margin of 5, and the text is Stop. And finally, we have Forward Button. We'll get this worked out. And the column is 3. It has text of forward, and it has to have a margin of 5 to make it look like the others. Okay, we have our buttons in place now. What we need is a stack panel over here so we can display a label and a slider for the volume. So here, let's click on it and go get a stack panel to place there. Well, that's certainly not what we intended. Set the margin again to be 0 or nothing at all. Set the name to be Volume Stack Panel. And we're ready to go. By default, the orientation of this stack panel is vertical. If I wanted to make it horizontal, I could do that, but the default is vertical, and that's what I want. Well, what do we need here? We need some controls inside the stack panel. I'm going to get a text block control. I could use a label, as we've done before, but it turns out that the text block, which is a formatted block of text, looks better in this case. So I'll drag the text block on, and let's fix this control up. Don't want to set the height yet. The name, I'll set, I don't even need to set a name because I'm not going to interact with it programmatically. The width, don't need to set. Do need to set the margin to be 5, and the content to be the word volume. There we go. Of course, it really needs to be inside the stack panel, and it's not. So let's fix this up, because we messed up here. I need to put the closing text block element there, and clean up this one here. There we go. Everything's good. We probably want to center it too, so let's set the horizontal alignment to be center. Okay, now we've got our text block in place. Let's set up the slider. Well, one more time. Go back here, select this, go to the toolbox, get a slider, drag it over, make sure it's within the stack panel. It is. And let's set the name to be volume slider. There we are. Set the margin to be 5. Okay. Set the min and the maximum values because we need those set. Minimum. It's tricky when you do this. You've got to put a space before you start typing. Minimum equals 0. Maximum equals 1. And the current value we want to be 0.5, so it's centered right in the middle. There's our slider. Well, phew, I think we got it. Now that we've laid things out, let's finish the column definitions so they work out correctly. We actually want the column definition set to auto for everything here except the last one, so that columns are just wide enough for the buttons within them. And there we go. So we have the columns wide enough for the buttons, and the slider, that stack panel, fills in the rest of the space. Well, right now, this control specifies a width and a height. We really don't want a width and a height for this thing, because we want it to fill the space it's given within the parent grid. So we'll remove those attributes, and the control at this point should look like this. We've laid out a bunch of XAML in here for all the stuff that's in there. It took a little bit of effort, but you've seen how we can create a somewhat complex layering of various grid rows, stack panels, sliders, buttons, and so on.